now that you've traveled around New Mexico, you have probably experienced the apparent emptiness of the place. There's vast stretches in which all you have is this extraordinary landscape. It's on a scale that is vast, and there is, for long stretches, very little apparently in it. So it is empty. And the emptiness of New Mexico, which is a paradox, but to the degree we see it as empty, it's very much part of the history of this place. And it remains to this day extraordinarily empty. Partly because one of the paradoxes is that New Mexico has always been empty and it has always been urbanized, which we don't think of. We think of urbanized, East Coast or the West Coast of the United States or around Chicago. You have these sprawling metropolises. But Chaco was a city. It's what a city looked like in the 11th century, a fortified complex of great houses. The Pueblo cultures that came out of it lived we call them Pueblo just means village, but those are, a 13th century city. And so there's never been a time in the history of New Mexico where when most of the people in this area, this region, haven't actually lived together. They aren't spread out that much. They tend to concentrate. And that's always been the history of the place. But the other thing of the emptiness is it's also been a place that people have gone to because it's empty. Well, there's not much there. I can go there and settle there. So there's histories of people living here since at least 10,000 years ago. There are sites that go back. These were nomadic settlements at the time, but where they did bison kill and things like that. We found the remains of that. And then the people who built the Anasazi, which is the Diné word for the enemy ones. But whoever they were, they moved in. They moved in probably around 200, 300 AD. And by the 9th and 10th century, they were building large complexes. And then the Navajo came in the 14th century. And then the Spaniards came in the 15th and 16th centuries. And that continued up to this present day. Then we had traders coming in the 19th century that was accelerated by the railroad. And then a lot of people started coming from mostly Chicago. Mm-hmm. Albuquerque has these Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad started in Chicago, went through Albuquerque on the way to Los Angeles. And so Albuquerque developed as a railroad station. I mean, it was a small little Spanish colonial village, but it developed because it was where they had repair yards. And so that brought the United States, and then the United States fought a war with Mexico and took it over. But people have constantly moved into this place. And so it has produced another level of the paradox the more I lived here, when I came here, I was East Coast, West Coast. Mm-hmm. I had been a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. I was doing my dissertation research, so I lived in Paris for 2.5 years. And then Penn said, all right, that's enough generosity. You're on your own, find a job. So I got a job here. And I thought, 2-3 years, a little teaching experience, and I'm out of here. And then I went to went on job searches and realized, no, I was actually more interested in being here. So from 1980 to now, I have lived here. Because so many things turned out to be going on in this empty place. And that goes back to what I was saying. It is still hard for me to get my mind around the fact that we have Chaco, which wasn't the only one, but it is one of the most developed, best preserved Native American settlements in North America. And if you've seen it, you know what an extraordinary place it was. And it was the equivalent of a capital. I mean, I don't know what interpretation you buy into. They used to think they were communal dwellings. They have now figured out that those great houses were mostly uninhabitable because there were lots of interior rooms. The only way you could have light was fire, but you'd suffocate if you had a fire in there. So what they were storehouses. And they were also built by organized labor, which was probably a version of serf labor, right? It wasn't voluntary, those kind of things. So there was a social hierarchy. This was where the wealth of that society was concentrated by overlords who probably did live there, and they created a great ritual and ceremonial center with these grand kivas where they'd bring together the people to bind them in unity with this culture. So it's an extraordinary sight. To have something so politically complex, so architecturally ambitious, and because of the climate, still over 50%, 60% still there. You can still wonder, oh, wow. Well, the same place we have that, we have the very large array, right? Which is a direct, it's to the degree Chaco is about, it's very aware of the relationship of Earth to Sun, the sun angles, solstices, and things like that. So it is like English Neolithic sites. They're also solar observatories. Well, the Very Large Array is a radio telescope that looks deep into the universe. So there's a direct line connecting that. We just see how the technology and the political structures have evolved over the intervening, 1,200, 1,300 years. But the VLA is here, the same reason that Chaco is there was nothing there. So it went there. And in between those is what brought you here, the bomb. The bomb. Did you go to Los Alamos?
We just stopped today on our way.
Okay.
Yeah.
There isn't that much because they've torn down most of the buildings, and the parts that survive are still classified. But that went there because there was, the Parajito Plateau actually has a long history of the habitation of Native Americans who were displaced by Spanish colonizers and ranchers, and then who were then replaced by Americans who took it over. And so there was a history of habitation, but it was basically empty, and it was a perfect place if you want to do something in secret. And then you go down to where the bomb exploded in the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the death man. Spanish Inquisition, a traitor, German traitor, is trying to escape. He had been captured because he was viewed by them as a heretic, and he died crossing that traverse, trying to get away from the Spanish. What better place? Because there's nothing out there. And yet, in that nothing, one of the most epical things happened in the 20th century. Define to me a more cataclysmic and world-changing event than the development and explosion of the bomb. The first one that over a city was in Japan, but the first bomb ever detonated in the world was down there, at Trinity site.
That was the first place that was nuked.
That was the first place that was nuked.
Yeah.
And there isn't a history because there was a radiation plume, so the downwinders are still fighting with the U.S. government, much as the Japanese survivors are fighting with their government to have recognition of what happened to them. But you constantly come back to that paradox. Here we are, almost literally in the middle of nowhere, and yet events and installations and facilities of global significance keep happening and being built here. And I don't know that many places in the world where those two apparent extremes are so often brought together. And it is because of the emptiness that this is the edge of something. We're on the edge, and yet this is a center in world history that a lot of places aren't. The reason why the Spanish came here in the 16th century is that what the Chacoans and the Puebloans had built looked in the distance like golden cities, Cibola, the fabled cities. So they coming here for the gold because of the Native Americans who were here. So people have kept coming here. The Spanish Empire, we're in New Mexico because we were part of Mexico, which was part of New Spain, which was part of the colonization of the world. So the European discovery of the Americas, a lot of it happened here. So we keep finding ourselves at the periphery in the center, where there's nothing, and yet everything, if you want to know the history of the world for the last 1,000 years, it keeps crossing through here.
So maybe Christopher, that's a really interesting. But it's an interesting point at which I'd actually like to take you to the moment, which is where we started, which is the moment when you came here, which seems to be, in the way that you describe it, your own that kind of youthful ignorance, where you probably felt exactly the same.
My ignorance turned out to be vast. And it began, you asked about Bart, because in a sense, when I came here, the first realization of my ignorance was the discovery of Bart's work. And somebody I just said, when I had accepted a faculty position here, I flew from Paris here, was here for 24 hours for an interview, jet lagged the whole time. What I remember mostly of that interview, this will make sense in a second, was the chair of the search committee took me in his little VW diesel rabbit, and we went out on the West Mesa, on the other across the river, on the escarpment there. And he said, "This is New Mexico." And I've been living in Paris, where my horizon was,
20 meters.
Yes, 20 meters. If we're extending it, right? That was
Which is still generous for European terms.
Yes, yes, it was. But gray, soft, atmospheric. And suddenly I was looking 100 miles in every direction into this thing. So I accepted the job, came here, and somebody said, "Well, you have to go see the weird architects stuff." So I started looking at this stuff, and I realized I had no idea what I was looking at. No idea. And this is part of the problem that Bart and Goff suffer from, is they don't fit into the conventional categories. So when you go to school and you learn the history of architecture, you aren't taught about this. You want me to talk about Corbu? Got it. You want me to talk about Mies? Got it. You want me to talk about Gropius? Got it. A little bit of Wright, but not too much, because that, complicates things. He was useful back early days, and then he was picked up, and the Europeans figured out what to do with him and made it real modern architecture. But it never went beyond Goff, beyond Wright. So I was looking at this stuff, and I had no way of categorizing, of classifying it. Where did I put this stuff? And so that started a friendship. I somewhat shyly reached out to him. Who was this guy? I did a show with him and 9 other architects, and then I did a solo show of his work and wrote a catalog. And by this point, I was starting to learn about him, and I realized even more how little I knew. So it became a lifelong project. So I had to become much more knowledgeable about Bart, and the best way was commissioning him build a house.
Which is where we're sitting.
Which is what we're sitting in. And when I commissioned him, we talked about that I was in Paris doing another book on French architecture, on the Paris Opera, on the Central Markets, the second book. And we talked about it in Paris. Again, it was a kind of autobiographical feedback loop between Paris and Albuquerque seemed to be connected. But by having him do the house, I got to see the whole process. from literally the beginning. My wife and I wrote up a program, gave it to him, which he ignored at the time because we hadn't acquired a piece of property. And then the moment we bought the piece of property, then the project became real. And then the program became relevant because he did what we asked in the program, but he could only do it in the context of the site. Apart from the site, the program as itself was an abstraction. It became real the moment it had a site. He did the sketches that I think I showed you downstairs over 2 days. He then maliciously, I still think, called me up and said, "Christopher, I laid out the designs for your house the last 2 days. I'm off to Hawaii for 2 weeks. I'll see you when I get back." I said, "Bart, you can't do that to me."
Cliffhanger. Yeah.
But he didn't want to. He wanted to develop them into the basic drawings and the model that's over there. So the next thing that happened is he did the presentation. My wife and I went over. He walked us through with the plans, and I think he
started from the lower ground floor.
He started from the ground floor, and as he likes to remember, and it's true, because it was a very tight budget, and I said, "Oh, this is all I get from my budget." And then he got upstairs, and then he said, I brightened up considerably. So, this is more like it. But we got to see, all right, so how does an architect conceive the house? What motivates him? How does he present it to the clients? And then building it. I was the builder of record, which meant that I had hands-on at every stage. I hired a young architect from Bart's office to be the project manager, but I had to run the budget, I had to pay the checks, so I was directly involved in the whole process. And watching the house go up and seeing how do you build a curved wall economically, for example? That's more complicated than some people might think. That doesn't happen. You actually have to know what you're doing. So seeing the whole process, and that really was sort of like, I considered it my postgraduate education in architecture. Now, because I've seen the process, and the process is vital there.
But yet Bart is not an architect. You said, you wanted to hire an architect to.
Right.
But Bart operates very differently to most architects.
Yes and no. Yes, he does from the sort of the norm that we're thinking about. But this is where something like Goff is very important, and where there is all these things come together. Because by the time I had Bart do the house, which was in 1990s when I decided on the process, and it was finished in 93. By that point, I'd been living in New Mexico for 10 years, and so I'd learned a lot more about it. It's still an ongoing process. You never get, I've got it all figured out. No, but I was starting to understand the scope and the openness of what it meant to live in New Mexico. So I had a better understanding of what kind of architect, in quotations, Bart was. And like Goff, these are architects who aren't from either coast. And in the United States, the norms of what architecture is are really decided primarily on the East Coast, but also on the West Coast and then around Chicago. Because you have Wright and you had Mies there and so on. And then between that is a lot of nothing. You don't really have architecture there because if you're a good architect, you work on the East Coast or on the West Coast. And yet it turns out, in that nothing, it's the same problem in New Mexico. New Mexico is in the middle of nowhere, it's on the edge of nothing, it's nothing. And yet, how do you tell the history of the 20th, let alone the last 1,000 years, without including New Mexico in it? Well, it turns out, in this nothing, there are an awful lot of very interesting architects. But they don't fit into the institutional categories, which means that they aren't taught in schools. That's the big thing. And it goes back to where I was, how I got a Ph.D. in the history of architecture. How did I get all the way there and never knew about this? Because I was never told about it, because it didn't fit into, and so it keeps repeating itself, right? So it wasn't so much that, yes, he wasn't a particular kind of architect, but it also means that what I thought an architect was turned out to be more interesting and much more rich and expansive than I've been taught it was. Bart, like Goff, both of them, they are very reluctant to go out and look for commissions. And really, I mean, Bart did it once and it didn't work, and it just proved the point to him. And I don't know if Goff ever actually did. Maybe he did once participate in a competition. They waited for clients to come to them. And that's what Bart's method was. He waits, and he constantly is working on a house now. I mean, he's always working on something. But for him, if somebody comes to him, they're already ready for him. If they wanted a normal architect, they wouldn't be coming to him. And the few who are confused about that, Bart will talk with them and they say, well, I don't think I'm the right architect for you. Because you end working with Bart, and it was the same with Goff, is a very much a collaborative exercise, but it is a collaborative exercise in which one of the criteria is he's given real freedom to do what he thinks he should do. In response, he will do exactly what you ask him to do, right? I mean, so he did. And the program that I wrote for this house was 10 single-space typewritten pages. I mean, it was very detailed. And he did almost everything in that. A few things got cut because of budget. And he and I, because I was the builder of record, I said, yep, we can't do that. But he was very, very faithful to us. And it's a house that my wife, Michelle, is as comfortable in as I am, because it wasn't just for me. Mm-hmm. We're two different people, and he made sure that both of our needs, practical but also emotional, were. So he did that. He did that. In return, he got to do exactly what he would do as Bart Prince. He wasn't going to do Spanish colonial style or anything, or any historical style. And I didn't want him to. And that's why I went to him. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
You are, and I wonder what. Well, I guess on one hand you explain that you discover Bart by coming to New Mexico, but on the other hand, I feel that this commissioning of Bart, in the commissioning of Bart, there is also a certain acknowledgement of New Mexico as a place.
Yes, yes, yes. Because Bart is completely a product of New Mexico. He left once, which was to go to architecture school. He went to Arizona because we didn't have an accredited school here. So he went to ASU, Arizona State University. It wasn't too far away. I asked him once why he didn't go to Taliesin West, because Taliesin isn't the same place. He said, well, Frank Lloyd Wright was dead. It was pointless to go. And he didn't need Frank Lloyd Wright to look at his buildings, and so he studied all of his buildings. But he needed a degree in architecture to become a licensed architect. But that was the one time he left. Otherwise, he stayed here, and he's grown up in this place. I don't know how much he talks about it with you, but
I asked him about it.
A very famous family. And actually, it's an interesting family on both sides. On his father's side, the Princes, they go back to a famous nurseryman. This is the age of picturesque gardens and landscapes. So this wasn't just a nurseryman. This was a nurseryman who was busily doing picturesque gardens around in New York State. And his great-grandfather came out here. He got an appointment as a territorial Supreme Court justice before the train came here. He came took the train to northern Colorado, and then took a stagecoach to Santa Fe and settled in. So his great-grandfather and then his grandfather, who had a ranch in Española outside of Santa Fe, where Bart grew up, learned how to drive. And when you learn to drive on a ranch, it's very different than learning to drive in the street. Your grandfather puts you in the truck and you take off and you figure it out because there's nothing to run into. Right? It's not like all the rules which we normally taught how to. You don't go to driving school. You figure it out yourself. And that was very much part of Bart's experience. This landscape, this place he grew up. It did teach him he didn't like living in adobe houses because they tended to be small and cramped rooms full of insects and things like that. Yeah. So he doesn't have a romantic, sentimental attachment. So isn't it? You build with the materials that they come along. You don't have to build in adobe. And I wouldn't want to build with adobe. I'll build you with modern materials. But I think more generally, by growing up here, to what degree is it just Bart who he was? I gathered, his father's now dead, but he had a somewhat combative relationship with his father. Bart has always been his own kind of person, and knew what he wanted to do. He was already in high school working for a local builder and contractor. So this it was like Goff became apprenticed as an architect, was still in high school. And so there's an interesting symmetry. And it is sort of following his own natural inclinations. So I think that's very much part of Bart. But this is there's enough space out here, cultural space and so on, to do that. Another paradox of New Mexico is that all of the history of this place and the cultures are all present. And I mean not only present in terms of their artifacts, but in terms of the people. So this is, for all the sort of nativism that's running around the country, it doesn't make sense in New Mexico. What do you mean by native? Well, how many centuries have you been living here? But all sorts of people live here. And instead of one new cultural group replacing the other, it was additive. So there are Native Americans, and it depends when you say Native Americans, which Pueblo, because they all have different versions of their language. Or do you mean the Navajo, or do you mean the Apache? And the same with the Spanish, because there are, in northern New Mexico, there are people who go back to the 16th century. They are not the same as the Mexican immigrants who are more southern New Mexico. So there are not only these large groups, but they break down. And the same, if you're Anglo, I'm an Anglo, but you could be German, you could be French, you could be English. Now, as somebody who's partly French, I'm a little offended by being called an Anglo. Mm-hmm. But that's part of the culture of the place as well. All of this mix. And it's not addressed directly, but it's sort of always in your face. So it teaches a certain kind of tolerance. If that makes any sense?
Absolutely. And it's not just that it teaches...
So you can deal with difference. It's not that you don't have to agree.
Yeah.
You just, okay, you have your ideas, well, I have mine. And that was great for Bart. Sorry.
So it teaches certain tolerance, but it also teaches certain willingness to experiment or try, even when things don't seemingly connect.
Yes.
I mean, I was particularly fascinated by the sort of Mexican Spanish-Mexican relationship to Native American, which of course were the colonized party of the Spanish, but in some way formed a certain cultural relationship that then sits in relation to a kind of Anglo. And I just find all of those, I mean, those relationships are very interesting. They're manifesting in the architecture and in the place very kind of confidently.
Yes. Yeah. Because, and this is, I mean, it's interesting. I'm just writing this with Goff. Bart and I share the preoccupation. Is Goff, people can't figure him out, so they keep trying to put him into a box. Rather than accept him as he was, and accept that he was confident in who he was, they want to say, well, you're this category, or you're that. And so why you're doing it is not because you're confident in what you're doing, is because you belong to this group or that group. Does that make any sense? Yes. But this is a place where, if you know what you're doing, just do it. Because there isn't assumed to be an absolute right or wrong way. There are lots of different ways, and you choose your way. So Bart very much has his way of doing it. But this house is, on one hand, uniquely a product of the late 20th century. You could not confuse it with anything built earlier. It is of its time, and yet this space, if you've seen Spanish colonial mission churches, they are single naves, so they just have two big walls, and they have beams called vigas that span them at regular intervals. This is basically a modern version of a Spanish colonial single nave space. It's adapted to a house. It does not actually quote it in its materials or its actual geometry, but as a type. And typological thinking, I think, in architecture is very helpful here, because it's an idea rather than it's not a specific diagram, it's not a specific, what's a centralized building? I haven't told you anything. It's a circle, a square, right? So typologically, this has a genealogy that goes back to that. The house itself is shaped like, it's a long body and then two arms that go out. That's a Chacoan great house. And like a Chacoan great house, it points to the winter sun. So weirdly, the whole history of New Mexico architecture is present in this house without it being literally quoted, because it's in Bart's DNA. When he was looking around the world, he was looking, what are great buildings? What are buildings that move you? And in New Mexico, Chacoan great house, you can't see it and be indifferent, or at least I couldn't. The same way you go to a mission church. Did you get inside a mission Spanish colonial church in your trip?
We went into a Taos Pueblo church.
Okay, that's a smaller one.
Which is small,
some of them are, one of the largest is out of Acoma, which is quite monumental.
Yes, we did not make it to Acoma.
But if you are interested in how people inhabit the world, which is Bart's interested in, then you say, oh, wow, that's a wonderful space that they created for themselves. And it does so many things that are interesting. And so that's part of Bart's education. I think also because his grandfather was a rancher. His father was a businessman and a politician, state representative, but his grandfather was a rancher, and so Bart spent a lot of time on the ranch. And ranches, the friend I mentioned who owned the ranch out by Star Axis, going out there to stay with him and his father, who was a rancher, interesting guy. But it's typical, they also break the categories. This rancher, who on one hand you look on him, he's a typical Republican. He has a ranch, he raises cattle. What does he do? He has guns and things like that. He even had a completely illegal submachine gun.
Nice.
But he could get away with it because he's out in the middle of nowhere. But this guy had a BA in English from Yale University. He turned out to be literate in a way that was unexpected. And also to know the land he was living in a very deep and intimate way. Profoundly engaged and invested in the same way that the Native Americans were. And also figuring out how to make do in that landscape. And I think Bart has, how do you make do in this landscape? And it gives you, even this house, this is the first house to be built on this lot. So for all the history of inhabitation, and this neighborhood was post-war in 1960s, but this lot survived. It was a vacant lot, and when we got there were a bunch of them. Most of them had been filled up. Normally you'd say, so what? But for someone like Bart, this is the first time something's been built on. How do you build recognizing the impact, the significance of that event? The first time something is being built here. Well, let's do something that's worthy of that. And I think that comes from his ranching culture as well.
I do want to bring in something slightly subversive into it, and that is to also think about American architecture and how it also reflects in this place. Because, you know, you paint a picture of a place that is on the margins, or it's in the center, but it's kind of, you know, on the margins by being in the center. And therefore it has this exuberance that it kind of formulates itself independently. But there's also that element of kind of broader American culture being reflected in it. And you know, maybe it goes back to the frontier theory, where the American kind of paradigm of freedom is predicated on the American wild, vast West. But then I'm trying to think about that in relation to architecture and how potentially this architecture embodies not necessarily any of those kind of political angles, but how does it embody what you may describe as American architecture? And does it?
Yes.
And how does it do that?
Well,
what is American architecture?
Yes, that's the question. And that's the question that explains why, after a little bit of Wright, a lot of what happened afterwards, Goff's generation and Bart's generation, is, except for special aficionados of that kind of architecture, it's ignored in the institutional official world, because it poses that question in a way that the institutional world has a great deal of difficulty answering. So it doesn't like, the best way to deal with a question like that is ignore it, right? So you're asking the rude question. I don't think the obvious explanation, what's the style? But there is no style to it. You see, that's part of the problem. Because we think there should be a style to it.
Well, so often we think style is a response to a question.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. So to the degree there is an answer to it, it is in pluralism. In other words, there is not one answer. Goff and Bart, like Goff, took literally a prescription that Frank Lloyd Wright said, didn't actually practice, but Goff did and Bart does. And so there are as many kinds, and then in parentheses, styles of house, as there are kinds, and then in parentheses, styles of client.
Not of architects, but of client.
Of client, you see. So that every time you do a work, you're responding to the client, and the client is the context.
Or the market.
Well, no, because, I mean, that's the other interesting thing. Wright tried and didn't really figure out how to do it, and Goff was fairly opposed to it, and Bart is fairly opposed to the market, because commercialism implies norms.
Yeah, and repetition.
And formulas. And so the very thing that they really resisted, or in Bart continues to resist, is the notion that he should repeat himself because that's economically efficient. They have taught themselves how to be very economical in their construction precisely because they refuse to be economically efficient. They are not interested in standardization. A better word for them is customization. And it occurred to me as I was thinking about that, actually, their critique of the whole modern age, it produced standardization. And they said, no, but that was really, they were doing this in the middle of the 20th century. That's a product of the 19th century. The whole process of technology has moved beyond that. We don't actually have to standardize. Everything can be customized. And I realized when my wife bought her Mini, it's customized. In other words, you pre-order it and you order all these features. Now it's customized within a context of standardization, but the basic point was you didn't go to the car dealer and get the same car everybody got. You got one that was specifically your paint colors, your upholstery, your whatever you wanted on the thing. They could add these things infinitely. And that's what, I mean, the materials, Bart isn't customizing the materials. They're standardized. He just uses them in a very customized way, if that makes sense. And Goff did as well.
Well, in an also intelligent way.
And very, well, you really, I mean...
there's a certain creativity in that as well.
And one of the many things that Bart and I have been grousing about with the show, because it brings it up again, they're throwing around a term, bricolage. Do you know that term?
Yes, of course, yeah.
And it's used in the show, and it was first used by Charles Jenks in a very nasty article about Goff that said Bruce Goff, the Michelangelo of kitsch. Mm-hmm. And bricolage, which he borrowed from Claude Lévi-Strauss, was one way he described that, and it's been picked up in this exhibit and in the catalog. And if you read Lévi-Strauss, which I have, apparently nobody else, they just sort of take it at face value. Lévi-Strauss says, there's the bricolage means tinkering, and he opposed it to how engineers think. Engineers think scientifically, and they think rationally. So they start with a hypothesis, and then they proceed linear to the conclusion that is predicted by that hypothesis. Whereas the tinkerer says, well, how am I going to do this? What's around? And it starts playing with it. But what they miss is Lévi-Strauss, after distinguishing these two types of makers, he says, then there's the artist. And the artist is neither an engineer nor a bricoleur, because they combine the knowledge-based system with the improvisation, the open-endedness or the savage thinking of the bricoleur, because what an artist does is proceeds towards an ideal form in an open-ended process. And so the process is what matters. Yes, it's not predetermined, and yet it is also not purely improvised either. It is. And it actually is, for me, for a sort of sociological point of view, the best description. What is an architect actually doing? Or a good architect? They're trying to figure out a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And they aren't trying to figure it out the way the engineer does, which is in a very linear way. They think in a field, and they have to work out how is it going to work. And that's why I quoted Goff with the notion of the Japanese term edaburi, the branches on the tree. It grows into, but when you get to the final form, it's coherent. It's not improvised. It's not accidental. It's actually very carefully calculated.
But now I'm gonna
bring this
back to the question of American architecture. Mm-hmm. So how does that then fit within this idea that maybe it's the plurality that is the answer to the question about what American architecture is?
And that, I mean, it's interesting talking about having this conversation in the context of this country. But as I say to him, I'm an historian, so the horrors of the current presidency of the United States are not unique and original to him. We've been here lots of times before. I joke with friends that until Trump came along, my most hated, despised president was Andrew Jackson from the 1840s, because he was a populist. He was a slave owner. He was the one who forced all the Indians out of Georgia while they ended up in Oklahoma. I mean, there's nothing redeemable about him. That kind of nativism, but of a particular group, right? And the history of this country has always been contested. It has always been violent. Before it was the United States. I mean, the Native Americans and the Spanish colonial people did not have a happy relationship in the 17th century, and the Spanish were brutal colonizers, occupiers. And that wasn't the United States. You can't blame you can blame the Spanish Empire for that. Or closer to hand, the ranchers, the wars, the range wars in the 1870s. Billy the Kid. That was made possible by the Winchester rifle and the revolver. The Winchester, the Smith & Wesson revolving thing. So you could shoot lots of times. And so the degree of mayhem increased, and you had very bloody feuds over that. So all the way through the history of this country has been that subtext of violence and the fighting that comes out of it. And we're seeing that again. And the paradox is because there isn't one dominant cultural model for this country. There's supposed to be a guiding document called the Constitution, but the current president doesn't even believe that. That's an impediment to him. But there isn't a dominant cultural model, so people have been fighting over which model dominates. And I, as an American, say, well, that's the alternative to democracy is the single-party police state. So you want order? It's easy to do. It doesn't actually work well for the countries that do it, but they get tired of the messiness of democracy, and they choose a single-party autocracy. They choose a dictator, and it doesn't matter right or left.
New Mexico is interesting in that respect too, because it is the only democratic state in the area. Colorado's is.
Colorado is used to be less. It's going that direction. Yeah. Arizona used to be less, and it's going in that direction.
But in recent elections, there's a real island.
There's over a long time. Yes, there for a long time. The last 50 years. I mean, these things are mutable. I mean, the irony is that when we speak of Republicans and Democrats, they basically shifted alliances with each other. Mm-hmm. And they did because of what happened in the 60s with giving rights, civil rights to people. And that caused all the Democrats who were Southern conservatives to join the Republican Party. And so all the Republicans who were actually political liberals to join the Democratic Party. So it was a big sort of musical chairs going at that point. But yeah, New Mexico has a long history of that. But again, it goes back to, it's less about the political parties, which are only relevant in New Mexico for the last 100-odd years. I mean, 150 years. It's much more embedded in the culture of the place and the kind of struggles. One of the struggles is over land rights. Who owns the land rights? And that's, people have suddenly discovered this all over the country. They never went away in New Mexico. The Native Americans always insistently laid claim to their land, and unusually, they've lived where they've lived for centuries. They didn't get pushed off to reservations. The one exception was under Kit Carson, he forced the Navajo to move to effectively an internment camp in New Mexico, pushed them out of their nation. But that was the only attempt to corral them. Otherwise, the Native Americans live on their own land. It's not like the story of the Osage and Cherokees in Oklahoma, who are living not on their native lands, but where they were forced to move to. But that brings with it a kind of, well, we're going to have to figure out this together. I don't know if that makes sense. It is interesting in that, because both Bart and Goff particularly, Goff was asked, he's from Oklahoma, and says, why do you work and why do you live? I mean, you grew up there, but you're doing this unprecedented architecture, so original. And he says, well, I learned it from the Native Americans. You look at them. And he said they had a very hard life, but their clothing, their music, their lifestyles were all extraordinary for me, much more interesting than the plain vanilla, as he put it, plain vanilla people he grew up with. So and he wasn't pretending that he was Native American, but he always looked to them as a model and exemplar for what he was trying to accomplish in his work. If the Native Americans could do that despite all their hardship, then he could do it as well in his corner of the world. And I think that's at work here as well.
I mean, this house, as you describe it, is a product of a very unique condition, cultural and geographical. But do you think that this house could also be somewhere in Los Angeles? Could it be one of the case study houses?
I don't think so, but I mean, maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's...
What is the attitude that maybe would have not allowed it to be one of the case study houses in Los Angeles?
Well, I mean, I'm just creating an intellectual argument here, so
yes,
I don't know how true this is. But part of it is simply the premise is that the site and the client necessarily would have been different. And so you just look at this house and you look at the house that Bart did for Joe Price in Coronel Del Mar. Same architect, but wow. Different client, different site, different budget. I mean, he was rich, I wasn't. And there's sort of different mixture of things. So the fact is, and Bart's done a fair number of works in California, and none of them look like houses that are in New Mexico. They look like they're responding to the fact they're in the ocean, for one thing. There's the Height House in Northern California, which is a series of A-frames, but they tilt so the whole house undulates, and it's addressing the sea, and you feel that it's both the wind, but it's also the waves. Not in a literal sense, but effectively. And so, and it's interesting how when he works in California, he did one house on Point Dume in Santa Monica that is actually steel. A lot of the other houses are laminated wood, but it's a steel house. But it also, the frame is very articulated. So there's a kind of a California quality to it, even though it's not out of redwood, but that kind of articulation of the frame to it. So I can't see Bart doing this in California.
And if I take you back to that first moment when you were taken to the edge of Albuquerque to look out into nothingness, did you feel a sense of urgency?
What I felt at the time was a sense of awe. It was just, wow. It wasn't articulated as anything more sophisticated than that. It was just like, wow. And it left an impression upon me that I've sort of worked on. I don't think I interpreted it. I don't think I intellectualized it at the time. I just went back to Paris with, this is a part of the world I've never seen or imagined before.
I mean, two strands go from there. I mean, one strand is whether that allowed you to also rethink Paris.
Yes, it did. Yeah, it did.
And in what way?
Well, how do it's probably on the level, not so much the topics, because the work I've done has always tended to be specific to buildings, case studies, and deep dives into them. And that's really what I'm most comfortable doing. So I did a book on the Paris Opera. I did a book on the Paris markets. What were the contexts? What was going on in the city? How'd they come out of that whole process using the technology of the time? The common denominator is, and it's probably just my prejudice, but both of them I saw the architects of those buildings as being misunderstood, and because they didn't fit for various reasons into the normative history of 19th century European architecture as being written by modernists, so it led in the right direction. And they both raised inconvenient questions. So I was both trying to, and that's like Bart. So there's a kind of, I'm interested in the people who don't fit, obviously, who are successful, but don't fit, obviously, into it. I think more fundamentally, what I encountered when I found Bart's architecture and therefore found an aspect of American architecture that had been kept hidden from me until that point, I said, where does it come from? So I started looking into American culture. And apart from the pluralism, I would say it's the pragmatism of American culture. And I mean pragmatism not in the narrow practical sense, but in the sense it was defined by William James and other pragmatic philosophers. William James famously said, truth is not inherent in an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. And I think that's, it led many people to say, well, pragmatism can't be a philosophy if it doesn't start with truth. But, and maybe it's not a philosophy, but it is a way of thinking about things. And that's how Bart worked. And so I've used pragmatism to get inside, to explain it in a larger cultural context. And it made me recognize things about France that I hadn't thought about, because France is home of rationalism, Cartesian thought. And that's the enemy of pragmatism, because it's all about a priori, absolutes. So it opened up to me aspects of French culture. Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes is a very pragmatic philosopher. He's not a rationalist philosopher. And interestingly enough, precisely the French, because of their heritage as being the home of rationalism, have had this sort of subcurrent of pushing back against it. The Romantics pushed back against it, and they've done ever since. And so that experience here made me aware of that. And I tried to, my first book on the Paris Opera, I didn't fully understand that, although I was writing somebody who was himself outside of the rational tradition. But I more clearly understood that in my second book, that things proceed towards solutions. They don't come from solutions.
It's interesting to then juxtapose that to your interest in the nuclear technology. Like you explained so clearly to us the other day, how the bombs actually, I guess, impacted the culture.
Yeah. Well, for me, I mean, it's all, I joke with myself that every book I've written is trying to take care of the failings of the previous book. So I keep moving. And the last book I did was on Japanese architecture. I got interested in it because the bomb was part of the history of this place. I was aware of it, but I always pushed it in the background. I hadn't really thought about it. But then I went to Japan for the first time in 2004. Never been before. I knew very little about it, but I knew a few things. So I went to Hiroshima because I wanted to see Tange's Peace Memorial.
Interesting.
And in a weird way, I had an experience equivalent to coming to New Mexico. I realized how little I understood about a supposedly familiar subject. I learned that the Peace Memorial is not where the bomb exploded. And you have to keep in mind, I was doing it in the context of 9/11. It's as if we put the memorial in New York City, I don't know, in Central Park somewhere, or down on Wall Street. We put it right where the towers came down. And the Peace Memorial is not. It's some 600 meters away from it. But there was nothing left, so they could put it anywhere they wanted. And now I can tell you, I didn't know at the time, but there really was no impediment. So it was a decision not to put it there. And why? And then I also learned that the bomb never touched the ground, which my head exploded. So there is no epicenter, there is a hypocenter, which is weirdly like what happened in New York City, because the jets hit those things at the top. They didn't hit the ground, the top, and the explosion came down. Well, that's what happened with the bomb, and I learned that they did that because Oppenheimer pointed out the effect of the bomb would be greater if it exploded in the air. If the ground, A lot of it's thrown back into the air or absorbed into the ground. But if it explodes in the air, it all goes down. So can one bomb destroy a city, blow it up in the air? So 2,000 feet up in the air. I went from Hiroshima where I was, and I discovered, one other, I don't know how much into the weeds you want me to get on this, I'm sorry. But while I was discovering these things, I said, well, where is this hypocenter, this new word? And I tracked it down. I had no Japanese at the time. It turned out to be difficult because there's the memorial, and on access to the memorial is what's called the A-bomb dome, which is a secession-style building from the early 20th century, built by a Czech architect, Jan Letzel. It was the Industrial Exhibition Hall. And they kept thinking that's what I was trying to talk about, and it wasn't. But eventually I found there is, on a back street, lined with commercial buildings, hair salons, and parking garages, a stone memorial in English and Japanese marking the location of the hypocenter, which they knew from the beginning. I mean, the Japanese went down 2 days after the bomb exploded, and they figured out where the bomb had actually exploded. They're aiming for a bridge, T-shaped bridge, which for a bombardier was a better site, so they could, but it drifted, so it, and, on a back anonymous street, there's this little marker. Here's where it happened, not over there with that grandiose, why is the grandiose monument over there if they knew it was here? And my head was just going nuts because I couldn't figure this out. I went to Ise, which is the great Shinto, of all the Shinto places in Japan, probably the most famous, associated with the imperial family. And there I brought home to me the fact that since the 8th century, every 20 years they've been rebuilding every not just the main shrine, but everything at Ise, which means that every building has next to it a vacant site. And the building is here, but in 20 years it'll be there, and the vacant site will be here. And they've been doing this back and forth for 1,200 years. Wow. I mean, with some interruptions, 1,200 years. And that gave me an intuition, and that all it was that it didn't matter where something was located in space, because everything was mutable in time. And so all you had to do was set up a space-time relationship between here and there. And that's what Tange was doing if he'd built it at the site, it would have been fixed in time and space. But being over there, it was free in time and space, because the point wasn't simply this was horrible what happened, is we don't want to do it again. And it's not going to happen here again. It could happen elsewhere again. What I'm getting at is it was one of those moments at which I was exposed to my own ignorance, and it started a series of investigations, took me into Japanese culture, turned me into a Buddhist of all things, and I gave up my Episcopalianism. But it also exposed me to ways of thinking that, interestingly enough, the counterpart to pragmatism here is in Buddhist philosophy, because everything is provisional, everything is conditional. It's not fixed and absolute. It's not a priori. And if you read Buddhist philosophers, they are as critical of Western rationalism as the pragmatists were. And what they liked were the phenomenologists.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Because they also were pushing back against rationalism. So it became...
And who were also French.
Some of them, Some of them Germans as well.
Yeah, exactly, came from Heidegger.
But certainly the French, Gaston Bachelard, I mean, that's French phenomenology right there. But the point, this discovery of mine turned out to be investigating a problem I was getting more and more understanding. How do we build in the world when we don't start with a priori certainties but proceed towards things? And so everything is always in process. And so that book, the topic is different. It's not about New Mexico, it's not about France, And yet it was, for me, a logical extension of what I was interested in. Because it turned out the Japanese, more than we are aware, everybody knows about the bomb, but the bomb didn't happen on our cities. So it's really part of the mentality of Japanese culture. It permeates it. And not just 50 years ago, but right up to the present. It's there. It's part of their cultural experience, which gave me an opening as I looked at, from Tange onward, a whole series of architects and how their buildings take on this problem. And as a way of explaining, why is Japanese architecture, it's modern, but it's not a modern one.
Well, I guess part of it is also the kind of unstable ground.
Yes.
Which kind of funnily relates to the instability that the bomb creates.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes. Interesting, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the inscription on the memorial, the cenotaph at Hiroshima, does not assign blame, which is very different. I mean, again, I saw this in the context of 9/11. From our perspective, the enemy was clear. Who did it? They were responsible. The Japanese always assumed there were two guilty parties. They were guilty and the Americans were guilty. They started the war, we dropped the bomb. So they couldn't offshore from their own actions. They were responsible. So we were all, and the inscription actually engages us all to the present moment. We are all complicit in this. There is no standing outside of it, because it is present with us. And it continues. I don't know if that makes, makes sense. And so you can call that unstable, but I think the pragmatic or the Buddhist point of view, it's not unstable. It's simply you have to let go of a whole series of expectations and preoccupations. If you let yourself recognize time. Einstein, when a very good friend of his, who used to go, this is when he was in Princeton, used to go walking with her. She was a physicist, they were just friends, and they'd have these deep conversations. She died young in the 50s, and he wrote a letter in German of condolence to the family. And he said in it, I can only paraphrase it, but he said, those of us like me who believe in physics are aware that there is no difference between past, present, and future. They're all now. And that's Buddhism. Buddhism says there is only now. But the now contains all time. It's not like just the moment and I can... In that moment, you have all of history. But that terrifies us. Because, well, where am I going? I don't know. You'll know when you get there. Right? But that's not all that, and William James was fascinated when he discovered Eastern philosophy and Buddhism for the same reason. It's not all that different saying truth is not inherent in an idea, it becomes true, is made true by events. The path is not predetermined. The path is simply one step and you take another step and at a certain point you stop and then that becomes the path. But you can't tell where you're going until you get there.
Do you think
and that's how they design these houses.
Yes.
Right? They don't start with a solution. They end up. This couldn't be anything other, but it can't be anything other because it's done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And therefore Bart can't do it again because the next project will be a different problem. And it'll end up with the same completeness, the same absoluteness, but reverse from our expectations. Well, he had to have had that figured out. Why? It doesn't come from anywhere.
Well, it's wonderful. Bart just said to me that he believes that architecture should be complete at every point in its process of becoming, but somehow it never becomes.
And he's a Buddhist, but he's not. I mean that's a very Buddhist way of thinking. But that's where I mean, without turning Americans into Buddhists, and Buddhism has a hard time in this country because it's less interested in American individualism. But there is this interesting intersection between an Eastern way of thinking and what you're trying to get me to corral, which is this American way of thinking. And yes, at every moment, that moment is complete. And that's a very, Bart thought that way, Goff thought that way. I've learned to think that way because I've had to, a lot of my education has been about undoing what I was taught.
And indulging in this amazing place and somehow...
Yeah, and learning that. But learning that without, the unlearning is knowing that I was going somewhere else.
What a wonderful project,
yes.
If you ever see your work as a project, because it's so situated here and so meaningfully. I just find it, having been around the state.
I've lived here now longer than I lived anywhere else, although I was a product of East Coast and West Coast culture completely. Growing up and getting educated. But I couldn't, I don't want to, so it means I can't really imagine living anywhere else in the United States now. I wouldn't want to. This place has given and taught me so much.
But you also made it in an interesting way.
I understand what you're saying. It taught me. I couldn't have become a Buddhist if this place hadn't already taught me to be open to things I didn't know. And that's. The Buddhists will tell you that's the hardest thing for human beings to do. They are threatened by what they don't know, so they react. Whereas Buddhism, so you have to respond to what you don't know. That's how you learn it. And it sort of flips it. But long before I was a Buddhist, I was living here and I was absorbing these things that I didn't understand and realizing, oh, I'm still here. I didn't disappear in a pile of ash in the middle of a parking lot because I dared to open myself up to not knowing.
And so much of it is about that relationship with time.
Yes.
That these things like a nuclear bomb or architecture, I guess, they really address time.
Architecture does. But also how it addresses time is, I have entirely thrown out the idea that you design buildings to do particular things. It's just an impossible notion. You design things to allow things that you can't predict to happen. That's very different. That's leaving it open, but I don't know what will happen there. The notion that a church can become a living room.
Some of the greatest buildings were not designed to be what they are.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So the notion that form follows function, misappropriated from Sullivan, who didn't actually say that. So once again, people have never actually read Sullivan, but they, Sullivan says form should ever follow function. Yeah, did you read the whole quotation?
We talked about that with Bart.
Yeah. Well, Bart taught me, and he got it from Goff, because Sullivan has a passage about every problem containing its own solution. And when I was writing the book about Bart, I was talking with him about this to get his response on it. And he said, well, that's true, but only insofar as it goes. What you have to realize is every problem contains multiple solutions, not one. You choose to solve it that way, but you could solve it that way or that way. The solution is not inherent in the problem. It's simply where you take the problem. Wow. But that moment that you realize that the whole notion of form and function having much to do with each other. Form accommodates function, but that's the most it can do.